Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. Dan is away on military leave right now, so we're going to bring back some of our previous shows that didn't make it to the podcast. We hope that you enjoy them. As always, we welcome your feedback. If you'd like a written transcript of the show, please email me at Karen, Karen, .cox, COX, @mail, MAIL, .wvu.edu, or call 304-234-3673. Thanks again for listening.
All right, so we'll start you out with just some basic disease-resistant varieties, but I want to divide a couple of these up by when they'll be harvested. So if you are a orchard and you want to extend your season so that you have multiple harvests throughout the year, you're going to want to plant different varieties of apples that come to ripeness at different times a year. So your very early apple, that's a good disease-resistant variety, could be Pristine. Some early ripening varieties would be Red Free or Williams Pride. Mid-season varieties include Jonah Free and Wolf River. And Wolf River is one of the older varieties that's out there. Your late-season varieties will be Liberty, Enterprise, or Adams, Permain, Norfolk, Pippin. That one has a big, long name. And then your very late variety would be the Gold Rush. Which is a golden delicious type of apple. Those are all really good disease-resistant apples. Liberty and Enterprise specifically are resistant to scab and fire blight and powdery mildew.
So going back to Pristine, it's some characteristic of the Pristine apple. Very early, medium size. It's a yellow apple. So if you're looking for red, that's probably not the one you want. It has a nice tart flavor, smooth, attractive. And it has an attractive finish. So it's pretty resistant. In fact, late July, early August is when you're talking about a ripening period for that one. It's got medium cedar apple rust resistance, but it has good resistance to powdery mildew, and it does have medium resistance to fire blight. Which fire blight, I think Karen can touch on some of the things you want to look at if you have fire blight, because that'll really take out a lot of your production. But fire blight is a disease that's the pruning disease that we have to watch out for a lot. The one that can spread really rapidly, and the one that's really important to sterilize your tools in between. So Karen will tell us a little bit more about fire blight.
Okay, so fire blight, if you are looking to see, did my trees have fire blight last year? It's real easy to tell this time of year because there's no leaves distracting you. And basically what you're looking for is a shriveled up shepherd's crook shape at the end of a branch. It looks like it has been burnt, and thus it gets the name fire blight. The trick with fire blight is it is active at this time of the year when most people are starting to get back out and get out into pruning. Fire blight is common on apples, pears, and even your city pears, those lovely, Bradford pears that are planted well throughout the city. They are very susceptible to fire blight, and they help to spread fire blight to our orchards. So when you are in an orchard and you are looking at doing some cleanup pruning for the beginning of the year, check your trees closely. Look for those. There's a blackened canker also that you can look for. But if you see those shepherd's crooks, basically you're going to say, tag that tree and say, I will prune you when it is dry, because when it is wet out and frequent rainstorms, that's when we can really spread it. Also, when you're pruning out fire blight, you want to make sure you cut a minimum of 6 inches back behind any wound wood. So if you have a branch tip that has decayed back, cut another 6 inches back. If you're going to end up leaving a branch stem that is not going to be productive, just take it all the way back to the tree and make sure you're cleaning your pruners between every cut when you're working with fire blight.
All right, Karen, good advice. And so when we are talking about fire blight specifically, some resistant to medium resistant type cultivars for fire blight, Williams Pride and Red Free. the Crimson Crisp is actually very susceptible to it. So stay away from that one. So Williams Pride, red free, good resistant cultivars to fire blight. But also when we talk about the later varieties, Sundance and Enterprise, those are going to be mid-October ripening periods as opposed to the ones we're talking about before that were July and August. But Sundance and Enterprise are really good resistance to fire blight. So yeah, but that is something to watch out for. And again, you can prune it out and then just make sure you take that diseased twig and burn it elsewhere. Don't leave it around with the other apples. All right, so let's go ahead. All right, so did we get to the red free yet? Yeah. Let's go with Williams Pride. Yeah, mid-August is the next one with Williams Pride. Dark red pearl, medium resistant type score for fire blight.
Yeah, Williams Pride is basically if you want a red delicious looking apple that tastes good, go for that one. As it looks a lot like a red delicious, but it does taste better.
Or a red delicious that's tree ripen, right?
Right, that's exactly right. Yeah, and so the red free, again, a very nice looking apple that's fairly early. It'll ripen in August. It's a medium-sized fruit, very pretty one to look at, but also it tastes good. And it has a tip-bearing habit similar to the Cortland, so you want to make sure that you're not pruning the tips off of your branches from the year before. It also has a regular annual cropping habit, which means you'll get a good crop every year.
Yeah. And so the red free is actually late August to mid-September ripening. It's a pretty apple. And honestly, in terms of disease ratings across the board, it scores pretty good for rust, for powdery mildew, and for fire blight. It gets some good scores. So that one's a nice, probably low maintenance type tree.
Yeah, and it's also a good multi-purpose apple. It's good for baking, holds up well in baking. It's good for making applesauce, and it's good for eating right off the tree as well. So it's a good multi-purpose apple.
But again, just because you have the seed doesn't mean you're going to get a red free apple. You got to make sure, because these are all clonally propagated. So the genetics that you like in an apple is not from the pollination. It's actually from the maternal tree. So just be aware of that. And you're going to have to probably order these things. And remember the rootstocks too. To work on a tree, dwarf to semi-dwarf is what you want. Anything larger than that, you really can't work the tree very well without specialized equipment. So the next one that I have on my list, Karen, is a Crimson Crisp. You might have another one that ripens next. But early September is when we start jumping to after with the Crimson Crisp. Rich flavor, moderate acidity, spicy aftertaste. Wow, that's interesting. Bright red fruit and cream colored flesh. It's got medium resistance for rust, for powdery mildew, but the problem with Crimson Crisp is that it is very susceptible to fire blight.
Yeah, so in this area, especially if you are around a lot of other apple, pear, or city pear trees, then you may want to avoid that one. Another one that's good that is resistant would be a Jonah free. It is a good keeping apple too, so it's going to store about 2 to 3 months, and if it's stored properly. Again, this is a mid-season apple. It's going to ripen late September. It is disease resistant, and it's similar to a Jonathan in texture and flavor, but it's a little less tart. So if you're looking for a sweeter apple, this one might be good for you. Again, it's a nice medium-sized fruit with a bright red color.
Yeah, and the only thing that the Jonah free would be susceptible to is rust. So you might need a few fungicide sprays on that one. Let's go with Liberty.
Before we do that, also, if you have a lot of cedar trees around, that's not one that you're going to want to plant.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. That's a great point. Yeah, cedar rust does overwinter on cedar trees. So a great way to make sure you're not getting cedar rust on your fruit is to either remove the cedar trees or make sure that those are clean when you are working with your apples.
Yeah, and cedar rust actually will travel up to a mile on the wind, so it's really hard to make sure that you've taken all of the cedar trees, because it is a native tree to West Virginia and Ohio. So it's hard to make sure that all the cedar trees are gone. It's also a very popular shrub in yards and things like that. But if you see those jellyfish-looking, alien, squishy spore spreading things hanging off of a cedar tree, it's a good time to collect them and just burn them, get rid of them, put them in a plastic bag and throw them away, and helps reduce the spread of that disease.
Yeah, just kind of trim that branch off, right? And then just get rid of it that way. That way you're not actually promoting that spore. But I will say this, even though it can travel long distances, the closer it is to an area, the higher the infection rate is going to be. So, that's cedar rust. That's a great point. Let's go to the crimson topaz. You got that one?
I don't.
All right. Well, the mid-September one as well. Medium-sized fruit, crisp and juicy, good flavor. Fruit has 50% orange-red striping over a yellow background. So it's probably one that sometimes you see these apples and you're like, I can't tell if it's supposed to be like that or if it's just not quite right. That might be one of those guys. Growth habit is spur-like, vigorous, and upright. It's susceptible to rust, and it's got medium resistance to powdery mildew and fire blight. Let's see. How about the Freedom? Are you down that far yet? Where are you at? Liberty. Let's go with Liberty.
Actually, I want to throw in one before that. Can I throw in one more?
Yeah.
All right. So this is an old variety, and for those of you who more like the heirloom varieties, this one might be up your alley. This is called Wolf River, and it has really big apples on it, almost a pound each. So it's very disease resistant. It's a very hardy apple. It's a red-skinned apple. It's got blotches of yellow on it. It's a fresh. It's soft and creamy and juicy, ripens in late September, early October. It's best suited for cooking and sauce. It doesn't break down like some of the other apples. It's not your best eating apple just because of the texture, but it is a good, really big apple. It would be good to get some attention at the market.
All right. Yeah, that's good. So Liberty, let's go with Liberty, which is, Liberty's a nice one. Medium-sized fruit, round to slight oblate, fresh, crisp, and juicy, and slightly sweet. Sprightly flavor. Fruit has 95% bright red stripe on yellow background. So that one is early October. So now we're getting into the later varieties. Medium resistance across the board with diseases. So
Except for rust.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I got medium resistance for rust. We're looking at two similar sources, but slightly different. But I got medium resistance for cedar rust, for powdery mildew, and for fire blight. What do you get, Karen?
So I have resistant to scab, fire blight, powdery mildew, but it's sensitive to rust. So that's something that we might have to look into to see what's really going on there. It might also be regionally affiliated. It might just be depending on if there's a lot of rust around, or it also could be a microclimate impact. Microclimates have a huge impact on orchards, and that is basically whether it's on a north slope or a south slope, at the top of the hill, at the bottom of the hill, is in a frost pocket. Those are microclimate type impacts. But that Liberty apple is really good for a storage apple if you want to expand your market later. If you say you're doing a winter market, it's a really good apple for that because it's going to keep 4 months if you refrigerate it correctly. And again, that whole saying of one bad apple spoils the whole bunch. It's very true because once the apple starts to decay, and any fruit actually, a tomato or whatever, once it starts to decay, it releases a lot more ethylene, which is what starts to break everything else down around it. So you do have to inspect them regularly to make sure there isn't one bad apple in the bunch.
Right. Yeah. Ethylene is that ripening hormone that we were talking about. Ethylene gas. Plants naturally produce ethylene. That's why it's really not good to put fruit in your fridge, because as something ripens, even though the cold temperature slows it down, confining any kind of fruit to a small enclosed location, as that fruit ripens, ethylene's produced, and when the plant senses ethylene, more ethylene's produced. So keeping things confined, especially fruits, will make them ripen really quickly. Bananas are notorious for producing a lot of ethylene, so try not to put bananas close to any other fruits, because if you do have a nice fruit basket, it's really not the best thing to do in terms of keeping fruit, because again, with the bananas, people always put bananas in fruit baskets, but maybe not always. But it's not the best idea because it does produce a lot of ethylene.
Yeah, and so one of the good things about that is if you have a banana that's really ripe and you have a plum that's not ripe at all because you got it from the grocery store and it's still a little rock, you can put it in a paper bag with that banana, and the banana will help to ripen your plum a little faster.
Yeah, but it's not going to help the taste of the plum.
Well, that's true.
All right.
What's next?
Nothing against plums, just against early or things that ripen off the tree. That's what I meant by that. And plums are one that's one that takes a lot of effort if you want nice plums.
Now, the good thing about plums, though, is there is a native plum to West Virginia called the American plum, and it is completely resistant to fire blight. Okay. So if you do want to do a plum, that may be an optional variety for you for preventing issues with fire blight.
All right. On that note, freedom apples. Large fruit, tender, juicy, sub-acid and sprightly. It's got 8% red stripe on a yellow background. Early October and medium disease rating across the board. In fact, I would say that the Liberty and the Freedom are very similar. I felt like I read the same thing twice. All right, Scarlet O'Hara. You got that one? Mm-mm. Scarlet O'Hara, large round fruit, medium red to orange color, rich, pleasant, slightly spicy flavor, early to mid-October, resistant to rust, susceptible to fire blight. We're not trying to scare you away from anything that might be susceptible to fire blight, but it's just good to know what to look for, and especially if you have a variety that's more susceptible to it, you'll be able to do practices to prevent it better. Sundance, now we're talking mid-October, medium-sized fruit, tart flavor, yellow fruit with some russet, resistant to cedar rust, medium resistance to powdery mildew, and resistance to fire blight. And Enterprise was the other one that's got good resistance to fire blight. Another mid-October, good quality late season, glossy red apple, looks like the Macintosh. Stores well, susceptible to fruit spotting disorder though. And then I have a Gold Rush here. The Gold Rush is the late October variety, probably one of the latest varieties that we have. Gold colored apple, excellent quality, good storage. Very late maturing, golden delicious type, and it is, however, susceptible to rust is what I have, cedar rust.
All right, so now the Gold Rush, again, is a super storage apple. I mean, this is one that is going to keep up to 7 months in cold storage. So it's a fantastic storage apple. Again, it tastes a very high-quality apple. It looks like Golden Delicious, but it has a tart, spicy, crisp flavor that does improve over time with storage. So it's definitely one that was designed to be harvested and then brought out once all of the other apples are gone. And I do want to go back a little bit earlier. So your Gold Rush is going to be late November, or ripening in November. So you do have to watch where you plant it. You don't want to put it low where a frost pocket will be sitting. But the Adams Permain is another old variety. It's a 19th century English variety. It's also known as the Norfolk Pippin that I mentioned earlier. It's got a grainy flesh. It's not very juicy, but it is a very aromatic and sweet apple. So if you're looking for a juice apple or a cider apple, this is definitely not the way you want to go. But it is a greenish red apple, and it ripens in mid-October. It's good for eating and for cooking. It also keeps well 4 to 5 months in refrigerator or with refrigeration. Now, apple refrigeration, like Dan was saying, isn't necessarily putting an apple in the refrigerator. There does have to be airflow. So typically when you're looking at food storage, you're looking at a cold storage area that has airflow where air is coming in and going out. That way you're not collecting the gases. So when you're designing, say if you're installing a cool bot or something like that, you'll want to make sure that there is some opportunity for the air to exchange, even if it's you just go in and open the door every so often.
And if you're just looking to kind of start something up, we talked about all these different varieties. A good thing to do, Karen did mention things about microclimates. There's a lot of good orchards in this local area. And you can, if you just kind of visit one, I'm sure, you can talk to the owner there and talk about the different varieties that you might have heard that you might have been interested in. And they're the ones that are going to give you a really good idea of what does well in the area and what doesn't. So always utilize, your local resources as well. very rare would you find a farmer that doesn't like to talk about what they do and what does well in the area.
Yeah, and also when you are designing your orchard, consider if you're going to try to do any agritourism associated with the orchard. Maybe if you want to host some weddings in the spring or something like that, you would be great to have some beautiful flowering crab apples. But those crab apples are going to serve an ulterior motive for you beyond just being beautiful, because you need those crab apples to pollinate your orchard apples. Some varieties for crab apples would be the Whitney crab apple. That's one that's actually edible. It's a little sweeter than your regular crab apple. There's the chestnut crab apple, also edible, and then the Dolgo crab apple. The Manchurian crab apple, the Indian summer, and the snowdrift. Those are all good pollinating ones. But the thing you have to know is if your crab apple is not flowering at the same time as your regular apples, that they're not going to cross-pollinate and you're not going to get any fruit. So you have to know when your apple variety or varieties are blooming and plant the associated bloom stage crab apple for that variety nearby.
Yeah, that's right. Most crab apples are probably going to be early blooming flowers. So those early varieties that we talked about, those are probably going to be a good bet for those for a lot of the crab apples that you might see or that you might purchase. Things like Pristine and Williams Pride.
Yeah, and we have a listing, so you can choose what apple you're wanting to grow, and we can let you know the corresponding crab apple variety to choose.
Nice. Yeah, it's really nice. The thing to remember, so if you're worried about crossing different cultivars, that doesn't happen with apples. It can happen with corn because the seed is what's influenced by cross pollination. The fruit itself, even though it's dependent on the pollination, the genetics of that seed or what it gets pollinated by has no influence on the fruit. The fruit is completely influenced by the maternal, by that tree genetics that's already there. But again, if you're taking that seed and you're going to plant it, you're never going to get the quality of the fruit that the type of fruit that you have, because the genetics are always going to mix. But the fruit itself does not have any dependency on the type of pollen that pollinates that flower. It is dependent on the pollination event. You can't get a fruit until you get viable seed. It's just the way that plants work. But what it gets pollinated by, as long as it's a similar species or the same species, I should say, it's not going to influence the taste and the look of that apple. So crab trees are great because they're actually designed for a lot of ornamental type display. So a lot of flowers, a lot of pollen. They have aromas. They are going to attract pollinators.
And so we've been talking a lot about choosing your variety for resistance. But one of the ways you can improve your resistance to some diseases is through the rootstock. And I'm going to talk about 3 different rootstocks. And the first one here is a semi-dwarf rootstock, and it is resistant to fire blight. So it can transfer that resistance to your apple species. It is a GM7. Okay. Right. So you can look at this and they're all identified by the number and a letter. So it's kind of hard to take this down over the radio, but you have more questions about it, you can feel free to call us. But the G210 or the G890 or the G969, they're all resistant to fire blight. They are tolerant to collar and root rot, and they are tolerant to the woody apple aphid, which feeds on the roots for part of their life cycle. They're still researching whether or not they're good for cold tolerance and productivity. If you want something that is good for cold tolerance, you're going to look at the Geneva rootstocks from New York, and they have been selected for winter hardiness. They're also resistant to diseases of fire blight and root rot, although they're still doing a little bit more research on that. They're also very good at growing new apples, so they're a high productivity rootstock. And you also have and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, the Budagolski 118. or the B118. Also very winter hardy. It's a semi-dwarf rootstock, and it is precocious. It's going to grow well, highly productive. It's got good fruit size. And so all of these are characteristics that are going to transfer onto the tree. Resistant to collar and root rot, and its resistance to fire blight has yet to be determined. Now, the Budagowski is good for steep hillsides. It's going to give you a semi-dwarf tree, and it's good for self-standing. So if you are on a hillside and you're trying to do your orchard on a hillside, that may be the rootstock that you want to go with. It's also, they have different spacing recommendations for clay loam, and sand. So it's very adaptable to different growing conditions.
Yeah, I would say the most important thing with rootstocks is to figure out what kind of soil you have and diseases. But it will alter the size of your tree, which is really important because, again, dwarf and semi-dwarf, easy to work with. Full-size trees, not so much. And on that note, we're out of time.
Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.